Imagine a young boy named Luis. He lives in a big house in Spain many years ago. The year is sometime in the early 1600s. Luis is bright and curious. He watches everything with his keen eyes. He sees the birds fly in the garden. He sees the servants bustle around the home. He understands the world through what he sees. But Luis cannot hear. He was born deaf. The world of sound is a mystery to him. His family loves him very much, but they do not know how to speak with him. They use simple gestures, pointing to food when he is hungry, pointing to his bed when it is time to sleep. They worry about his future. Can he learn? Can he inherit his family's name and fortune? These were heavy questions in a time that did not understand deafness. For thousands of years, deaf people have existed in every part of the world. They have been members of families and communities, just like anyone else. However, history was often unkind to them. Many people held incorrect beliefs about deafness. In ancient times, life for deaf people was often very hard. The ideas of famous thinkers shaped how society viewed them. The great Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived around 355 BCE, wrote about the senses. He believed that hearing was the most important sense for learning. He wrote that people who were born deaf were also unable to speak. From this, he made a terrible conclusion. He concluded that they could not be taught and could not reason. This idea was very powerful. Because Aristotle was so respected, his words were treated as fact for centuries. This single belief cast a long, dark shadow over the lives of countless deaf individuals, locking them out of education and opportunity. The influence of these ancient ideas continued into the Roman Empire. Roman law was very specific and had rules for everything, including the rights of citizens. For deaf people, these laws were often restrictive. For example, a person who was deaf from birth was often legally compared to a child or someone who was mentally unwell. They could not sign a will to pass on their property. They could not enter into legal contracts. They could not even be held fully responsible for their own actions. The law assumed that because they could not hear or speak in the typical way, they could not possibly understand complex ideas like ownership or justice. These laws reinforced the myth that deaf people were incapable of thought. These beliefs were not just legal rules. They shaped everyday life and social attitudes. Many people simply accepted that deaf people were a lost cause. Families might love their deaf children, but they often hid them away from public view out of shame or fear. The Renaissance, which began in Europe around the 14th century, was a time of great change and rebirth. People began to question old ideas and look at the world in new ways. This spirit of discovery touched art science education. A few pioneers began to challenge the idea that deaf people could not be taught. A major breakthrough came from a quiet monastery in Spain. A Benedictine monk named Pedro Ponce de Leon, born c. 1520, died 1584, became one of the first known teachers of the deaf. His work would plant the seeds for a revolution in deaf education. He lived and worked at the San Salvador Monastery in Ona, Spain. As a Benedictine, he belonged to an order that sometimes practiced vows of silence. To communicate during silent periods, monks used simple hand gestures. That gave Ponce de Leon a unique insight into non-spoken communication. Wealthy noble families with deaf children approached him. In that era, inheritance laws often required a person to speak to claim title and wealth. These families were desperate to educate their sons. Using monastic gestures, Ponce de Leon began developing teaching methods. He did not create a full sign language but used a combination of tools. He used hand gestures to represent letters, a basic manual alphabet. He pointed to written letters and taught associations between sign and letter. Then he guided students to try speaking the sounds of those letters. The groundbreaking work of Pedro Ponce de Leon did not die with him. His legacy inspired others to continue the important task of educating the deaf. One of the most important figures to follow in his footsteps was Juan Pablo Bonet. Bonet was born in Spain around 1573. He was not a monk, but a man of many talents, a priest, a soldier, a secretary to a powerful nobleman. His life took a turn that would change the course of deaf education forever when he entered the service of the de Velasco family. This was the same noble family that Pedro Ponce de Leon had worked with years earlier. Bonet was hired to be the secretary for Juan Fernández de Velasco, the constable of Castile. In the constable's household, Bonet met the nobleman's young son, Luis de Velasco, who was deaf. The family, having seen the success with their older deaf relatives, was determined to provide Luis with an education. Bonet took on the role of his tutor. It is believed that Bonet may have learned about the methods used by Ponce de Leon, though he never mentioned the monk by name in his work. He dedicated himself to teaching young Luis. He carefully observed what worked and what did not. He developed a systematic and organized approach to teaching, one that he believed could be used by others to help deaf children learn language. This dedication led to a monumental achievement. In 1620, Juan Pablo Bonet published a book. Its long title in Spanish was Reducción de las letras y arte para enseñar a hablar a los mudos, which translates to Summary of the Letters and the Art of Teaching Speech to the Mute. This was a historic moment. At the heart of Juan Pablo Bonet's book was a clear, step-by-step plan for teaching. His method was built on a simple, brilliant idea: use sight to compensate for lack of hearing. The most famous part of his system was his manual alphabet. It was a set of one-handed signs. Each hand shape stood for a letter. For example, a closed fist represented the letter A. An index finger pointing up represented the letter B. The alphabet wasn't a language. It's a tool for spelling spoken words. It created a direct visual link between written letters and visible gestures. That link made a powerful first step in teaching language to a deaf child. Bonet began lessons with the manual alphabet. First, teach the student to form each hand shape. Then, show the written letter that matched each sign. The student would associate letter A on paper with the fist sign for A. This was taught slowly and patiently, one letter at a time. Once mastered, the teacher could spell out whole words. Spelling allowed teachers to name concepts and people, breaking the wall of silence. The manual alphabet acted as a bridge between the student's visual world and written language. But Bonet's goal went beyond reading and writing. He wanted to teach speaking too. After letters via hand signs and writing, Bonet moved to articulation. He showed how the mouth moved. He showed how the tongue moved. He showed how the lips moved. For example, lips come together for the P sound. He had students feel vibrations, placing their hand on the teacher's throat. The publication of Juan Pablo Bonet's book in 1620 was a turning point, but it did not solve every problem overnight. Old myths die hard. Even with a clear guide on how to teach the deaf, many people continued to believe that it was impossible or not worth the effort. However, Bonet's work provided a powerful counter-argument. Let us compare the myths with the facts that his work helped to establish. A common myth was that deaf people could not think logically because they could not hear words. The fact, as Bonet's teaching showed, is that deaf people think just as deeply and complexly as anyone else. They simply process the world through different senses. Another harmful myth was that sign language was not a real language, but just a collection of crude gestures. While Bonet's manual alphabet was a tool for spelling a spoken language, his work opened the door for people to take manual communication more seriously. The fact is that true sign languages, which developed within deaf communities, are complete and grammatically rich languages. They can express complex scientific ideas, beautiful poetry, and everything in between. Bonet's book, by being the first to systematize a form of manual communication, was an important step toward the eventual recognition of sign languages as legitimate and equal to spoken languages. Bonet's legacy is complex. Some later educators, known as oralists, took his ideas about teaching speech and tried to forbid the use of sign language altogether. This led to many years of painful conflict in deaf education. However, the core of Bonet's contribution was profoundly positive.